Hey everybody, Jem Schofield here, and welcome to the 4K for 10K camera series. If you have not yet done so, please watch the overview video where I talk about the criteria for the 6 candidate cameras that we are featuring. I also want to mention that this series is not about doing a direct comparison between the cameras. It is not a video-based user manual for each of the cameras, nor in-depth reviews of the cameras that are featured. The whole purpose of this series is to help you figure out which camera or cameras that we are covering might be right for your productions. A camera series would not be complete without some test footage. So we decided that we were going to record to each of these cameras internally at their highest resolution and at the best formats and codecs that they could record to internally. Now in this particular video, we're going to be talking about the Sony FS5 II, so let's get started. So unlike the other cameras in the series, I'm actually going to start this off a little bit differently with the FS5 II, because if you can see here, this camera body, it is extremely small, and it is definitely one of the things that makes this camera unique in terms of our 4K for 10K cameras. And if I just go ahead and take this off, we can see that this has a Super 35mm 4K sensor. It is an E-mount, which is incredibly versatile in terms of not only using the E-mount lenses that Sony makes and a number of other companies, but it is very, very easy to adapt to other lens mounts. For instance, we have this Metabones adapter here, and a lot of people use that to convert and go from an EF mount lens to this E-mount, but there are other adapters for other lens mounts. In fact, there are special adapters that you can get that have optics in it where you can change your field of view and your effective depth of field. So with this lens on here, and this is a 24-70 lens, we actually have the ability to shoot just like this with the camera system. It has an electronic viewfinder that is built into the camera. There is actually a big eye cup, which I don't have here, which is included. And then the big one here is that one of the 2 XLR inputs is actually built into the camera body itself. So this is, just as it is, capable of shooting. So it's really small, actually kind of feels like a medium format camera when you're shooting this way. And if you take this camera in this configuration, especially if you're using small prime lenses, it is absolutely ideal for things like gimbal types of setups, and also for traveling. You could easily take 2 or 3 of these camera bodies and it would take up very, very little room in a case. Then we can actually start building it up a little bit more in terms of its usability. So there are 3 other parts or main parts that are part of the camera system. So I'll put the EVF down. We have this top handle here, which actually passes electronics through to it. That is where our second XLR input for the camera is. So it's actually built into the handle. And then we have this grip remote here, which just attaches here. So you just line up the dots, and then you go ahead and that is now in position. And it has this quick release right here, so it's very easy to adjust the grip remote. And we have our LCD, which I'm actually going to put in the most traditional place on the camera, which is over here, but we could mount it here, we could mount it here. It's just a 1/4-20 thread. In fact, we could even mount this screen onto the camera body just by itself if we wanted to go back to that strip down configuration that I showed you in the beginning. So if I now just take this camera off the fluid head again, we can see what it's like now built out in its final form. It's incredibly compact, and that's really one of the big selling points of this camera, and it's kind of like a shrunken down FS7 II if you take a look at it. Now, a couple of other things that are included, or main things that are included with the camera system. There's a battery, the BPU30. It is a smaller battery, so I definitely recommend that you get 1 or 2 larger batteries or a bunch of these smaller ones if you want to keep the weight down. And then on top of that, you do get a charger, which also doubles as the powering unit for the camera. So if you're going to be using multiple batteries, I would recommend looking into a dual charger, but again, this will charge batteries, or it has a DC out, so it will power the camera system as well. And those are the main components or main parts that come with the FS5 II. What I want to do now is actually go ahead and take you around the camera body itself, from a camera operator standpoint to see how it's all laid out. So let's go over to the front left of the camera body and talk about this, which is the ND filter system on the FS5 II. Originally introduced with the first FS5, this is a very unique ND filter system. We have essentially 4 positions here. In position 1, by default, this is 2 stops of ND, and normally we see that in a lot of camera systems as a decimal point as 0.6. In the Sony systems, they will show you their ND in a fraction-based format, so it'll be a quarter. Then we go over here to 2. By default, that's 4 stops of ND, and then 3, that's 6 stops of ND. Now we can go all the way up to 7 stops of ND in the menu system, and you can assign these different positions here to different levels of ND if you want. But really where the power comes in is when we switch this over and we go from preset to variable, and we have to make sure that this switch down here is set to ND. And then when we use this wheel here, we can actually pull ND. So we can dial in our ND between those 2 and 7 stops very, very precisely. We can also use it in an auto mode where if, for instance, you're panning the camera and you're going from a darker scene with less light, it will actually gradually ramp that ND in a way to make sure that your exposure is right. Now, what's so powerful about that, and it's also included in the FS7 II, is that you're not changing your ISO or your gain, and you're not changing your iris or your aperture to actually get your exposure value. So you can lock in your depth of field, you can lock in those noise levels, and then by pulling your ND, that's in fact how you are changing your exposure. So a very, very powerful feature of the camera. Now we move over here to some of the other things. You can see that we have some numbers on these buttons. So there are assignable buttons on the camera system, not as many as some of the cameras that we have inside of the series. There are actually 6 assignable buttons on the FS5 II, but we can make them do different things if we go into the menu system and assign them to different jobs. Quick and easy access to our audio levels here and switching between auto, gain control, and manual. And then over here we have access to our menus, which we'll be taking a look at a little bit more in depth in a few minutes. And then over here we have our card slots for our 2 SD cards that can be inserted into the camera system. We can do double slot recording, we can do relay recording. The cards don't need to be incredibly fast because the camera tops out in terms of internal recording at 100 megabits per second. So we don't really need to have super fast cards for that. Again, battery bay over here, electronic viewfinder, and then when we go over to here, these are our ports. The 2 ones that we want to talk about here are the SDI out. And one of the most powerful features of this particular camera system is that it ships with a raw output. So we get raw out over SDI, and then we also have an HDMI 2.0 terminal. And then we go over here to this side of the camera system. We've already talked about the XLR inputs, but we have this grip unit here, and this gives us a lot of functionality. It's laid out just slightly differently from the FS7 II, but if we take a look over here, and I'll just pull that down here, we can see one of the 3 assignable buttons on the grip here. We can start, stop, record, and we can navigate our menu system quickly and easily. When we have the menus up, we have assignable button number 4 up here, which is for focus magnification. There's a dial here that we can use generally to change our aperture. There's a zoom rocker, and then over here on the inside of the camera body is assignable button number 6. And then if we just pan over here and I bring this down, we can take a look at this handle. And what we have is a zoom rocker on here, which is great when you're hand holding the camera for low angles, with start, stop, record as well. There is a built-in microphone over here for scratch audio, and also, most importantly, this right here, which is called the MI shoe, which stands for multi-interface shoe. And when we are using that, and it is proprietary to the Sony camera systems like the FS5 II and the FS7 II, we can use something like this, which is called the SMAD P3. This is actually the SMAD P3D for a dual channel receiver. And you'll see here that there is a male connector here, and there is also the contacts for the MI shoe. And what's happening now is we don't actually have to use a standard output to these XLR inputs here, because all of that data is now being passed through that MI shoe. So let me just go ahead now and turn on the camera. And the last thing that we'll talk about before we get into the menu systems is the screen itself. And I'm actually quite impressed with the screen that this camera comes with. It is definitely usable outside. It's not incredibly reflective, so out of the box you can use it. And it's also very nice to be able to have an electronic viewfinder so that if there is too much ambient light and you are seeing too many reflections, you can always use the EVF instead. So let's go ahead now and go into the menu system of the FS5 II. And this is not a comprehensive menu tour, but as with the other cameras, just going into some of the key features that I think you should be aware of so that you have a better understanding of the camera. So let's go ahead and take a look at the camera paint menu inside of here. And there are a lot of options that are available to us with the FS5 II, but I'm just going to concentrate on some key ones that I think are important. The first one here has to do with ND filters, which I spoke about a little bit earlier on. So when you go inside of here, this has to do with the 3 preset positions for the ND dial. And we can go in there, and they don't have to be predetermined fixed amounts of ND. We can go in there and actually dial that into a quarter, an eighth, a 16th, a 32nd, a 64th, or a 1/28th, which means that we can go beyond 6 stops of ND. We can actually do 7 stops of ND in this camera system. Now, in addition to that, in this menu, we can also talk about zoom set. And this is a feature that I find to be very useful on a camera like this, which is we can go in and have our zoom type to be optical zoom only, or we can actually turn on this feature called clear image zoom. It will actually allow you to zoom beyond the normal field of view that you're used to getting. And as soon as that's on, I can go ahead and take the zoom rocker on the handle or on the grip of the camera system, and I can actually zoom into 150% of my image size and its normal field of view. Now, where this comes in handy, of course, is if you need to get a little bit more reach in terms of what you're trying to do. So if you're on a 24-70 and you get that additional reach, that could help in certain shooting scenarios. And then additionally, if you take prime lenses, you can actually use clear image zoom with that as well. You could take a 25mm lens and effectively get a 50mm field of view. So that's pretty amazing and also a cool feature in the camera system. Now back into the menu here again, we have some additional options, and this one, face detection, is actually grayed out. And the only reason it's grayed out is because I have my focus set to manual now. And then when I turn on autofocus, we have the ability to turn face detection on. And just with all of these camera systems, you will have to try the AF system to see how it works in your shooting scenarios. I've actually found that the FS5 II is quite good in terms of autofocus, and the face detection on the camera system actually also works well. A couple of things that you should just note is when you're using AF, especially face detection, it does tend to have problems with heavy beards. So it's not always great for somebody like me, and also has a problem with glasses sometimes. So again, try it in different shooting scenarios and also with different people, but of course you can't rely upon AF in any camera system 100% of the time. And I scroll down here and we'll also take a look at this, which is picture profile. And this is where you basically go in and paint in camera. Now there's a shortcut to get to that. By default, it is assignable button number 2 on the camera body. It'll say P profile, and it will bring you directly to that menu so that if you want to switch this while you're shooting, you can. And each one of these has been designed to give you a different look, has a different gamma curve, it has a different color gamut. So for instance, if I go to PP8, and we go into that and we take a look at our settings, we can see that the gamma curve is S-log3, and the color mode is sgamut3.cine, and we can go in there and set that to a particular color temperature if we want. For instance, right now I'm in daylight balance, so I might switch that over to 5500 Kelvin. And we can go back up here. And then, for instance, now we have under picture profile 10, hyperlog gamma. So you have your hyperlog gammas inside of here. and you can also record a BT 2020 color space so that you can have that ready and it is ready for broadcast. And there's been a lot of talk about the new default setting on the camera system where they've taken color science from the Sony Venice and put it into this camera. From the results that I'm seeing, it's a very pleasing look, but definitely something that you want to try out on your shoots in terms of what you're doing. It is not, from a gamma standpoint, S-Log, but it does have a nice roll-off on the highlights, and it is using a Rec 709 curve in terms of color gamut. So just be aware of that when you're using the camera system. And speaking of gamma and gamuts, let's go back into the menu and have a quick conversation of one other thing that you should really be aware of when you're using a camera like this, especially when you're recording internally. So if I go into this menu right here and I take a look at my recording options, if I'm going to be shooting with this camera in XAVC QFHD, which is quad full HD, 3840 by 2160, then I have basically a few options in terms of not only my frame rates, but also the data rate that I am recording in. It should be noted that in UHD 4K, when you're recording to your SD cards, that the absolute highest data rate that you can record in this camera is 100 megabits per second. So to put it in perspective, in HD in this camera system, you can record up to 50 megabits per second, but when you go to 4 times the resolution, you're only at double the data rate. It doesn't mean that you can't record great looking images with this camera system, but this camera does not have the internal high data rate recording that we see with the other cameras that we are featuring in this series. And what that means in real terms is that what you can do with the image in post-production isn't necessarily going to be the same as with some of those other cameras in the series. But we have a feature inside of this relatively low-cost 4K camera system, which is pretty amazing. And if we go into our menu here, we can go to Rec Set or Record Set. And inside of our file format, you will see that there are 2 options here for recording RAW. So we have RAW plus XAVC HD, where it'll record XAVC internally to the camera system as well as spit that raw signal out, or just a raw signal. So let's just go ahead and choose RAW and XAVC HD, and we'll set that up and step out of there. And then in addition to that, under Rec Set, I can go in and decide what frame rate I want to spit out of that raw output. So I'm going to switch that over to 23.98 or 24p as it reads on the camera system. So we are recording internally now in XAVC HD at 50 megabits per second, but from the raw output of the camera system, we're spitting out a DCI 4K signal. And in fact, that's the only way we can do DCI 4K on the FS5 II is externally. And now you're pushing a raw signal out of this tiny little camera that you can use an external recorder with. So pretty amazing in terms of what you can do with this camera related to that. And those are really some of the really core features of this camera. So now let's go ahead and take a look at how we had the camera set up at AbelCine in New York for our test footage, which you can download and take a look at. And so what we did is we went into Record Set and we set it up like this, XAVC QFHD. And for our record format, 2160 at 24 frames per second and at the highest data rate. And in addition to that, for our picture profile on this particular camera, we decided to use PP8, which is S-Log3 and sgamut3.cine. And we did that because with all of the other 5 cameras in the camera series, we were shooting in log or in RAW, so it made the most sense for this. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the footage from the FS5 II. Here are our 3 shooting scenarios that we are going to be showing you, and they are an interior low light example, an exterior example, and also a mixed lighting example. So our low light test was really, again, to do something where we were shooting in low light and pushing the sensor a little bit. Just a large soft key source. We had a little bit of light in the background. We wanted to make sure that there was some color in that image so that you could see how it reacts to that, but also to make sure that we had dynamic range in the frame. For our exterior, we wanted to simulate as close as we could bright daylight, but with high dynamic range throughout the image. We're not using any bounce cards. There's no negative fill. We're just using the light that is available to us in that space. And then for this scenario, we really wanted to make sure that we were kind of mimicking a typical situation where you might have some mixed lighting. We're using lots of practicals. There's obviously daylight coming into the space. And we also have a couple of fixtures that are playing here. The main one is our key light for our main talent in the foreground. And then there's a small light down there in the back left of the frame, which is just basically throwing a little bit of a pool of light into that shadowy area to lift it a little bit. And again, the goal was to show you and give you something with some real dynamic range to play with in the image. Let's take a look at our low light settings for the FS5 II and how we had the camera set up to record internally. And here we are taking a look at that same frame without the information up on the screen, so you can get a sense of what that log recording looks like. But please remember that if you are watching this video, that this is heavily compressed footage and you need to download the original files to really see what you can do with those images. And now we're taking a look at that footage with a Rec. 709 LUT applied to it. When we decided to put a Rec. 709 LUT up on here, it wasn't to show a color grading example. It was more to just give you a sense of what you might be looking at if you were applying a viewing LUT in production. Let's take a look at our exterior bright daylight setup for the FS5 II and what our camera settings were. Now we're looking at that frame without all of the information up on the screen. And here we are, just for reference sake, taking a look at that footage with a Rec. 709 LUT applied to the image. Our last test scenario is our mixed lighting scenario, and you can take a look at our settings for the camera there. We had a lot going on in this frame, as you can see now that we've taken away that information in terms of our settings. And here, just for reference, is the same image with a Rec. 709 LUT applied to the footage. So the goal here, regardless of low light, exterior, or sort of a mixed lighting situation, was to show you a lot of dynamic range within each of these images. So we were exposing for middle gray to where we should have for each of those cameras, and that allowed us to make sure that we had proper exposure for you to start with your images. So there you have it. That's the Sony FS5 II, and hopefully this video has helped you figure out a little bit more about the camera and where it might fit into your small to no crew productions. As always, please download the sample footage that we took with the camera system at AbelCine in New York, and you can compare that to the other cameras in the series, and also check out the other videos for the other cameras in the series. Thanks for watching.